Roy Goodman. Roy is a local self-published author. Methodical in his writing, his latest book is Isaac's Story. This is a story of people who live boldly and defiantly through difficult times. Join Roy in a conversation regarding the writing process of his latest work.
Hi, my name is Roy Goodman, and I'm a novelist. I've always liked writing. I've written poetry since I was a teenager, and somewhere probably 20-something years ago, 30 years ago, I just felt I had a story to tell, and it needed to be told in the form of a novel. And I began working on my first novel, which is called Angel Play, and that took 14, 15 years from the first draft to the time it was published. And it came out in 2013. My new novel, which is what I want to talk mainly about, called Isaac's Story, is very, very different from Angel Play. And again, I just felt there was stuff inside me that I had to talk about. And this novel was the vehicle for doing that. My body is almost not here. There are times when I feel like a ghost, like I can't weigh more than a couple of ounces. I feel myself riding on the breeze. I know my end is near, and frankly, I've had more than enough of this place. I'm ready to lie eternally in a hole in the ground. If I knew who my maker was, I'd be happy to meet him or her. I might even have a word or two to say. My name is Isaac Simon, and I am 102 years old. I was born in the year 1900. That's the truth. In fact, I only lied about my age one time. Big mistake. I'll tell you all about it later. Of course, I'm telling this story in my head. I can't move. I certainly couldn't sit upright and hold a pen. Sometimes I feel someone touch my hand or stroke my cheek. It's nice. Reminds me of when I was first married. Reminds me of my beloved Virginia. She was a marvel, strong, bold, with a passion for life that was explosive, and a warmth that was all-embracing. We used to hold hands a lot, and other things there's no need to get into details about. My mind and my memory, unlike my body, seemed to be working just fine. I remember everything almost from the day I was born. Well, not quite, but I do remember the shtetl in Lithuania where we lived until I was 10 years old, Linkiva. I remember our two-room house with a steep roof that leaked when it rained. I remember mud in the spring and snow and cold in the winter. My brother Chaim and I had to get up early to bring in snow so Mama could melt it to make tea for my father. From the age of 6, I had to feed the chickens, clean out their coop, and bring in the eggs. Chaim, who was 4 years older than me, milked our cow. I envied him until my father lost the cow in a game of chance, and Chaim had to milk a goat my mother had bought with money from vegetables and eggs she sold at the market. The goat was an unpleasant animal. It was always trying to escape, and it hated being milked. Maybe that's why its milk tasted a little bitter. Mara, that's the name Chaim gave her, kicked poor Chaim several times. He threatened to take her to the butcher, but he never did. I would hear him cursing her while I picked my way through the hen house. Over the years, I met many folks from the old country. They all talk of their parents like they were saints. Their fathers were very learned and wise. It seemed like everyone had a father or grandfather who was a rabbi, and their mothers were the best cooks and bakers in the world. Mine were not like that. My father was an ignorant peasant who worked as a builder's helper from time to time and spent most of the money he earned gambling and getting drunk. He would quote a few selected passages from the book, but could not read a word. His favorite teaching was the story of Noah, who got drunk and in his drunken state was embarrassed by one of his sons. Noah then cursed that son for not respecting his father. I think my father really believed the Bible gave him permission to drink and mistreat us. Like many drunks I've run into in my life, he was mean and loud. He often shouted at my mother and Chaim and me. When we were little, my mother would wrap us in her dress, and we all hid from him. It was warm in there, When we got too big, Chaim and I would go outside to escape him. Unless it was too cold, then we would crawl under the bed we shared. My mother was a wonderful, strong, warm person, but a terrible cook. It seemed to me that her cooking was the cause of many of the arguments between my parents, but not all. Chaim was the scholar, at least that's what my mother used to say. I hated school and preferred to spend time wandering in the woods near the shtetl, watching the birds and catching frogs in the stream. I loved to draw the things I saw. My father called me a dreamer, which I think was meant as an admonition to be more practical. I took it as a compliment. My father would shout about my useless meanderings in the woods. He went on and on about me not getting my chores done, not helping my mother, not doing well in school, not learning the book. I think I spent more time trying to avoid him than anything else. Then one evening in February 1910, 2 months before my birthday, everything changed. My father took one drink too many and slipped on the ice in a snowstorm as he was making his way home from the tavern. He rolled into a ditch and was not found until the sun came out 3 days later. Uncle Kulner told us about my father's death. My mother breathed in deeply, but said nothing. How could she say out loud that a burden had been lifted from her? Thank you. I don't block everything out chapter by chapter. I had a pretty good idea of who the main characters were supposed to be and how they related to one another and how they behaved. I had a pretty good idea of the arc of the story. Isaac's story covers the entire 20th century, from 1900 actually up until just after 9/11. So I knew who the people were, and I knew what they were going to say. And I just sat down and started writing. Now, one has to be very disciplined, and I was. I would write probably from about 8:30 in the morning till 12:30, 1, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 5 days a week, sometimes 6 days a week. And it was very deliberative. I mean, I would write, and then the next day when I sat down, I would read what I wrote, both to get the thread of where I was going, as well as to edit it. And then I would, once having done that first step, I would continue writing. Now, Isaac's story is an historical novel. There's a lot of history in it. I like to think of it in a way as Zinn's history, people's history of the 20th century in novel form. So there was a lot of research that had to be done, and fortunately there is such a thing as an internet. And there were some days where I spent more time researching than actually writing, and other days the opposite of that. When I got to the end of this book, and it is a large book, it's over 500 pages, and I did one edit, and then I actually created fairly detailed character sketches of all the major characters in the book, and went through it, where they lived, where they were from, how they talked, how they dressed, what they were interested in, just quite detailed outlines of all these people. And so then I went through the book again, focusing on one character at a time and fleshing them out. And still editing. I mean, the version that was published of Isaac's story was the 24th, I believe. It's also somewhat biographical, autobiographical. I mean, one of the things I wanted to do was tell the stories of some particular people in my life. The book is dedicated to Uncle Max and Uncle Frank. And these are two real people. Max is a man by the name of Max Simon, who I never met, who was my maternal grandmother's brother. And the two of them left Lithuania, their little village in Lithuania, in around 1912 and went to South Africa, which is where I grew up. 2 years later, World War I broke out in the colonies and in Europe, and Max joined the army. I knew very little about him. My sister, who is the family historian and genealogist, was able to get his military record, which she sent to me, and I was just fascinated with this guy and saddened by his story. And so the character of Chaim, who is Isaac's brother, is built on this military history of my Uncle Max. The other person, Uncle Frank, is somebody that I knew fairly well. He was my wife's uncle. He was someone who served in some of the worst events of World War II. He was at Normandy. He was in the Battle of the Bulge, the invasion of Germany, and all of that. He saw some terrible stuff. He was a man who did not talk a whole lot about his experiences until very late in life, but he did tell us about stuff. And I do have all the letters he wrote home, a scrapbook that he made, and a lot of conversations. And this character of Albert, who is Isaac's eldest son, is built on Frank's story. Just one other little note. The name Simon, the main character is Isaac Simon. Simon is a family name. It is my grandmother's unmarried name. But it just seemed like the right thing to do. I knew the story of these people before I started writing it, so there's nothing new that I got about them. But as fictional characters, they begin to tell their own story. If I go back to Chaim, based on my great uncle Max, all I had was his military record, which is kind of like a skeleton. It tells you this happened, he did this, he was stationed here, he was in hospital there in this period of time. And I had to build a person around that. And so when you read Chaim, you read about a very troubled young man who's away from home and who finds himself in a war. And he's, it's very, very difficult for him. Isaac is in some kind of medical facility. He can't speak, he can't move, he can't see, but his mind and his memory are very active. So he's telling himself his life story. And it is a story of people who lived very actively and very engaged in the events of their times. Early on, right in the first page of the book, you meet Virginia, who is the love of his life. Isaac comes from this working-class Jewish family. Virginia is Virginia Appleton, old-moneyed Boston Unitarians. And yet they fall in love. And so you have issues of religion, you have issues of class that play out throughout the story, throughout the book. As I said, they're actively engaged in things. So his mother is a union organizer. They're involved in the women's right to vote movement. And, they're involved in anti-Vietnam War. They're involved in child labor issues, the civil rights movement. These are, as I said, there are people who are actively engaged in what goes on. Isaac also is an artist. And so there's a lot of discussion about art and architecture. Another important, very important part of the story is that interspersed between him telling his story are the very limited interactions that he has with caregivers and family members. And these two things play off against each other, these two themes. And they really propel the story forward. I knew from the start it was going to be a big book. It's 102 years. It covers from when Isaac's born in 1900 through just after 9/11. Most difficult thing was making sure that it moves at a good pace so that you don't get bogged down in anything, that when things change and pick up again, you don't have to go back 25 pages to remember what happened. So structurally, that was really the challenge, to make the story continue to move, even while you're telling sort of two different stories in parallel. And also, when people tell stories, they don't start, the day they were born and end up, the day before they died in a straight line. They digress. Something reminds them of an incident that happened totally out of chronological sequence. So while Isaac's story, as he tells his story, it is very much in chronological sequence, there are very important digressions. Somebody who visits him will say something, and it reminds him of something that one of his kids did. And he'll sort of go off and talk about that. So holding all of that together was the main challenge. And I have to say that folks who've read the book, many of them have told me that despite the fact that it's so big, it moves fast. And they were really sad that it ended. I'll be working, I'll be writing, and then I'll reread and I'll go, wow, Isaac said that? That's awesome. That was really smart, Isaac. It's not like I was smart. It was Isaac was smart. It's a wonderful process when you really get inside your characters' heads and they take you places. My hopes of being able to retire on the proceeds from my writing did not quite materialize. It's a the book is self-published. And to get published even to get an agent, let alone get published by, a regular publishing house, is extremely difficult. I sent out about 130 query letters for Isaac's story. And most responses I got were basically, if I got a response at all, that wasn't a form letter, it's too big. That's it. The Harry Potter novels are bigger than this. Not that this is like a Harry Potter novel, but the size should not determine. But apparently it does for way too many people. Do it because you want to do it, because you got something to say, you got a story to tell. And be disciplined about it, and don't lose hope. And follow your characters. Trust your characters. There's one other character I want to talk about. I mentioned that Isaac falls in love with Virginia Appleton, who's the daughter of upper crust Boston Unitarians. And I decided, I was very consciously deciding that that's who it was, and that they attend the Arlington Street Church in Boston, which is this beautiful old church right by the Boston Garden. And if you haven't been there, you really ought to go. It's a beautiful church with beautiful Tiffany stained glass windows. So, of course, I went to the website to get a little bit of the history of this church. And one of the things I was interested in was who was minister of the place during the first part of the 1900s, which is most of the interaction that Isaac and Virginia and whatever have with this church. And so I'm reading through the list of ministers, and the person who was minister from about 1904 to the mid-20s was a gentleman by the name of Paul Revere Frothingham. And I shook my head. I said, I got to use this guy's name. What can be more old Boston money than Paul Revere Frothingham? And then I said, well, if I want to use this guy's name, I have to learn about him. I can't just use a name. And I was able to find some of his writings, as well as a biography that was actually written about him in the 30s. And he was a really interesting guy. He was within the Unitarian movement, which was kind of split between the humanist view of Jesus and the mystical view of Jesus. He was way over on the humanist side of things. He was very active himself, opposed to the First World War, very active around supporting the League of Nations and women's suffrage and all these kinds of issues. And so here was this guy who was a real historical figure, and I wanted to put him in the novel. So everything, he's interacting with fictional characters. So everything you read about him in there is this kind of blend between some of the things that he really did, as well as some of the things that I imagined he would have done. So the character that emerges is someone that I believe is very true to who he was in spirit, and yet was fictional. I don't write as much poetry as I used to. And a lot of what I write, when I do, is more narrative. It's still short. My style of poetry, I tend to be very reductive. I rarely write anything that's more than 15, 20 lines. But it's more narrative. It's almost like a little storytelling. And then again, poetry, while in a novel you don't want to waste words either, in a poem it's even more boiled down to, every syllable counts, shall we say. So, but it is a different way of thinking. And when I was writing Isaac's story, which took, 2.5, 3 years, I don't know if I wrote more than half a dozen poems. I am still writing, but I haven't written anything that I'm really like. Since I finished with this. Well, this, and Isaac's story was finished around the beginning of this year. It came out just before COVID hit. I'm actually working on a series of short stories based very, very loosely on my experience, on people I've met delivering Meals on Wheels. I've met some fascinating people, which I can't talk about. So I've been thinking, a lot of these folks have stories in them. I can just look at a picture on a wall in their home and create a whole fantasy about it. So I obviously can't write about them directly without their permission. But there's enough sort of inspiration out there. So I've been beginning to work on that. I have written 3 or 4. My goal is to write 26, one for each letter of the alphabet. I'll have Annie, then Barney, then Charlotte, then whatever, You can find Isaac's story, if you have an e-reader, through any of your normal sources, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, iTunes, etc., etc. Also, the physical book is available from Amazon.com. I have a website. It is roygoodmanwrites.wordpress.com.
Thank you for joining our virtual Art Week. City Arts Nashua appreciates the support of our sponsors and you, our viewers. Please continue to support our local artists and our musicians and theater groups. For more information on arts in Nashua, please visit cityartsnashua.org.